And we're live. Hey, everyone.
Hi everyone.
Welcome to episode 3 of Coffee Club. Today, I'm really excited to talk about this topic because all three of us have spoken extensively about migration. Let's maybe introduce ourselves. Trisha, you want to go?
Hello, I'm Trisha. Yes, I am Java developer advocate at JetBrains and Java champion, and have spoken extensively about migrating from Java 8 in the past.
Yes, and I'm really excited that Johan could join us today. Johan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Johan Janssen. I work for Sanoma Learning as a software architect, and I speak and write a lot about migrating, and I actually do a lot of migrations now to Java 17. So it's an interesting topic.
It is. It is. You won't find people that care more about migration. Uh, so we will make this session really interactive because we want to hear about your experiences with migration and whether you've already migrated or you are looking forward to migrating or kind of afraid of migrating. So we'll be asking questions. And please post your answers in the YouTube comments. We're going to be very diligent about looking at that because we really want to hear from you. But before we dive in too much, let's kind of give a little bit of background on where we're at right now. Because we do need a little bit of an intro. It used to be that, if you're migrating from Java 6, it used to be pretty straightforward. You're going to 7, 7 to 8, and then starting 9, we had this new concept of LTS versus non-LTS, or long-term supported versions versus non-long-term supported versions. And the first version was Java 9, which went out of support after 6 months. And then we saw Java 10 come out, and then Java 11 became the next long-term support release. And then we got Java 12 through 16, which is non-LTS versions. And then now we have Java 17, which is the current long-term supported version. So there's a lot of, I think, a lot of curiosity around where people are at, and how many people have adopted long-term supported versus non-long supported versions. And I think there was some, when we were kind of talking about this topic, Johan, was curious about people using non-long-term supported versus long-term supported versions. So if you're using either of those, let us know what you're using in production. But we're also very curious about what Java version you're using right now. So what Java version are you on? Are you on 16 and you're going to 17? Are you on 11? Are you on 8? Are you on 7 or 6? It's okay. We won't be writing names down if you are. Kind of let us know what Java version you're on. And maybe Trisha and Johan, you can tell us more about, what Java versions you've migrated from and kind of the experience you've had a little bit.
I'm going to let Johan go first because he's a guest, and so he should be allowed to go first.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, I've done quite some migrations. I think the most important ones were from 8 to 11 and from 11 to 17. My experience is that from 8 to 11, most applications needed some changes because Java EE modules were removed there. So you at least needed some extra dependencies. From 11 to 17, yeah, we'll dive into the details later, but there were also some things removed. So depending on what application you have, you might also have to add some dependencies. But if I look at it in general, if your dependencies are up to date, then upgrading to a new version of Java in general is relatively easy because most of the issues are in the dependencies, is my experience. Some are in the code you wrote yourself or in unit tests or integration tests, but if you make sure your dependencies are up to date, then I think you solved like 95% of all the issues already.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. It's not as extensive as yours, but I have been looking at existing projects, some open source projects, and there was a lot of worry around migrating off 8, particularly to 9. But at that time, which is now, like, how old is my youngest daughter? So she's only 4, so that was 4 years ago. At that time, the whole ecosystem needed to migrate to 9. The libraries, the build tools, everything. And it was quite a big change for anything which was reaching inside the JDK. So like any of the libraries and build tools, it was a big change for them. for anyone looking to move off 8 now, a lot of that work has been done, as you were saying. Like the dependencies have all been updated. The frameworks are all using modern versions of Java. They've all made all the changes that need to be made. Maven and Gradle supported 9 almost straight away. So as long as your build tools and your dependencies are up to date, generally that should be enough. You also alluded to the other thing, which was that you may need to add dependencies on things which have moved out of the JDK as well. But again, it's a lot of it is just poking around inside your pom.xml file and just making sure all the right stuff is there and it's up to date.
Yeah, and I know we're going to really dive into pain points here in a little bit, but I wanted to get an overview of your experiences with it. And it's definitely my experience has been very similar to what you've been talking about. And I'm watching the chat, and there's a lot of people on 11, which is really impressive. And some people are on 8, which is really expected. And some people are on multiple versions, which is extremely curious because one is on 6, 8, and 17. That's a really wide variety there that I haven't seen before.
In my experience, and our audience can correct me if I'm wrong. In my experience, people who are using 6 are often Android or UI. So that can sometimes be why you're using more than one version of Java, because you've got front end, back end, multiple services, or you've got some legacy code, which if you're maintaining, I don't really like the term legacy, but if you've got an enterprise application which works perfectly fine and you don't want to do anything weird to it, sometimes you will just keep that on the version of Java which just works. Particularly at Dalia, actually, I wanted to point to your expertise here, particularly if you're running on application servers and you already have everything working exactly the way you want it to. You don't necessarily want to upgrade your application server, your version of Java, and all your dependencies, especially if you have a change control process which requires you to like jump through a lot of hoops in order to tick those boxes off.
Exactly. I remember I developed migration tooling, which helped with Java migrations. And I would get this really interesting question of how can I migrate without the source code? I don't have access to the source code. I just want to migrate my application. And I was like, oh, you have an app that you don't even have access to the source code and you're trying to migrate that? Woo, good luck with that. So a lot of times they wanted it to do bytecode manipulation and all those kinds of things. And I'm just kind of thinking, you don't know where the state of the app is if it's just kind of running in a basement and no one's really touched it. Sometimes it's just using an old version and it's working, so you don't touch it. So I completely understand. Yeah.
I was going to say that leads us really nicely to the next question of like, why would you want to migrate? Like, what are the reasons for migrating your application? I think in that thing that you just mentioned earlier, I think the answer is don't. You don't want to migrate, because if you don't have access to the source code, you're not going to be making changes to the application, right? You're not going to be evolving it or moving it forward in any way. So presumably there are some cases where you might not want to migrate.
Yeah, as long as it's your vendor is still supporting like security fixes or vulnerabilities or whatever, and you can still pay for the support. I think the answer is like just keep it as is. You're not really doing forward development on it anyways. But if you are doing forward development, then you definitely want to be doing that migration. And I think that's a great question, is why migrate? And I want to pose that question to the folks that are listening, is like, what are some of the reasons you're wanting to migrate? And I want to start with Johan here, because he had some perspective on why did you go ahead and migrate your applications at your company?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I think you talked about some applications it's hard to upgrade, for instance, because you're tied to application server or you don't have the sources. But I think in those cases, it's at least important to make sure you update your minor versions, because that's often possible quite easily. And you at least have all the security fixes and even performance improvements in minor updates of Java. So even if you can do the major updates, I still recommend to do minor updates. And for especially for major updates, of course, for us developers, it's the cool new features like records and pattern matching that were introduced recently, which are really cool. But I also saw some statistics about performance improvements, for instance, for garbage collection, where garbage collection was a lot faster on 17 than on 11, and it will even be a lot faster on 18, at least according to the tests they did. So there are various performance improvements, security improvements in various areas. And I think, yeah, for a lot of people, the nice and cool new features, the language features are the most interesting ones, at least for us developers. And I think something that a lot of people forget is that, for me, a reason to upgrade is also to keep and attract your employees, because employees, they don't like to work on Java 7. At least most people I know don't like it. Some like to do it, but in general, people like to work with new technologies. So I think that's also a good reason. Now developers are quite scarce, and it's hard to get them and to keep them. That could be a good reason to convince management to spend time on it.
Yeah, I want to highlight the convince management, because that's the question that all of us have gotten, is how do I convince my management that we should migrate? And I know, Trisha, you have some opinions on that, because you even divide the reasons between when you're talking to the business versus when you're talking to the developer.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not as difficult to persuade a developer to migrate to a later version of Java as it is to persuade management, because developers, they want to use records, they want to use text blocks. So some of the smallish features like text blocks seem really dumb, but you can imagine, like, once you start using them in your code base, like, this is so much easier. For a developer, once they start using them, especially using them with IntelliJ IDEA, which says, by the way, did you know you could use these things? The newer versions of Java, it's quite compelling. And for me as a developer as well, I want to keep my skills up to date. I want to keep my skills sharp. So of course I want to play with the latest versions, especially if everyone's talking about records and I don't know what they are. So as a developer, I do want to stay up to date. And that ties into the thing that Johan just said as well, which is that as an organization, we should be offering developers the sorts of things they want, like career progression and skills updates and keeping them interested in stuff. So from a business point of view, it does make sense to keep your developers happy. There's a balance, obviously, between what the business needs are and going after shiny things just for the sake of shiny things to keep your developers happy. But as you said, attracting new developers to hire them and retaining your existing knowledge is an important business thing too. So if you're using Java 6, you should perhaps be considering at least Java 11 to try and get your developers to stop leaving your company in droves. But another thing from the business point of view, as mentioned, was security and performance. And I want to talk a little bit about performance, because the garbage collection story is an interesting story, because it's not just a case of speeding up existing garbage collectors, it's also the addition of multiple different garbage collectors. Having done a lot of development in London, where everyone in London thinks they do high performance Java, and having worked in somewhere that actually does do high performance Java, a lot of people always talk about garbage collection as being the thing which is about the performance of Java. It's not true. It is one of the elements that is about high performance Java. One of the things that I like about modern Java is that having multiple garbage collectors with different profiles can simplify some of that. So instead of tweaking all of your little flags and having some niche knowledge of how a garbage collector should work, in theory, you should be able to drag and drop one of these different types of garbage collectors, test it, and see if it performs better. And I think that's a little bit better than all this niche knowledge of how these flags interact with each other on particular machines. So the garbage collector story is very interesting on 17. But also performance, from a performance point of view, someone was saying, have you got any numbers of how Java 17 performs versus an earlier version? There are multiple benchmarks of that sort of thing. As is the case in performance, the answer is always it depends. So it's going to depend a lot on your type of application. I have also done a lot of work with databases because I used to work for MongoDB. And I can tell you that tweaking the performance of the JVM when you have to go over a network, potentially to a different country, has absolutely zero impact on your overall performance. So when you say you care about performance, you have to figure out like what you really care about. But generally speaking, the more recent versions of Java will give you better performance at the micro benchmark level with no work, because the language developers are already making the language more efficient. They're doing more, and the JVM is an amazing platform. It does a lot of optimization for your code, and they're doing more and more clever stuff there. There's also, since, if you're on 11, this probably doesn't matter to you, but if you're on 8, since 8, there have been some optimizations around things like memory use with compact strings and things like that. So there's also performance from a sort of memory use point of view. So the performance picture is quite a big picture, but generally speaking, when you use a more recent version of Java, you will get performance improvements without even really needing to do anything, even not counting the garbage collection story.
That's a great point, and it reminded me of you talking about, you know, the cost of having using less memory. So if you're having, you know, you're having to pay for the memory, or you're having to pay for all those things, you're saving money that way as well. But I do like that there's a lot of people in the chat saying, you know, I think one person said I had to ask why not migrate, and my boss said no budget. And I know, Johan, you've had to deal with like convincing folks like, oh, you should really migrate. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a common theme, something I hear a lot, like there's no priority for grading to new Java versions. And I think there are different approaches. You can, of course, collect all kinds of arguments, maybe money related or on productivity, because the new APIs might be more productive to use from developers and thereby save money for the company. In the end, what I experience is that it often ends up in a lot of discussion, and in the time that you discuss it, you could have done the migration. So what I often do is when a new version came out, when on a Friday when my hours were nearly done, I would simply start upgrading, see what failed, and then I could make a better estimate. Like, yeah, probably I need like 1 or 2 days to fix some unit tests or stuff like that. And then I could give a concrete estimate, because otherwise I've heard people estimate like weeks to months to upgrade an application from 8 to 11. That's ridiculous. I mean, you can do it in a matter of days normally, unless you have a really old application with terribly old dependencies and stuff like that. It's relatively good to do in a couple of days per application, I would say, even for huge applications. And the other, yeah, I'm now in a position where I'm luckily that my manager allows me to do upgrades for other teams, because the other teams, they don't get time for it either. So I'm now actually helping other teams to do the migration, so they don't need to convince their management. So it's a bit of a tricky thing. I think in the end, developers benefit maybe most from a new version, because they can do all the cool new stuff. So why not maybe invest some hours yourself to do the upgrade, so that you can actually use them. In the end, we're all responsible for it. It's not only management, it's also we developers who apparently don't give it enough priority.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like the idea of like, in the time you're talking to management about why you should migrate, it could take that much time to actually migrate the app. I don't know about that. It probably takes a little bit longer with the testing and all that good stuff. But I am curious. There's a lot of people that are already on 11. And my question to them is, you know, going from 8 to 11, do you remember how long it took? How long did it approximately take for your application to migrate? That way we can kind of get a ballpark of, you know, how scary should it be for other people? And it definitely depends on how big the application is, you know, the type of application that you have. Because if it's, you know, if you're really digging into the bytecode and doing some, you know, really complicated, not complicated, but more internal stuff, then it's going to take longer, because you're calling more methods that got removed or got hidden. And that kind of segues to the pain points. So maybe let's start by giving a brief overview of the pain points that we saw from 8 to 11, and then dive into 11 to 17 and spend more time there. So from 8 to 11, I do want to ask the folks that moved from 8 to 11, what were the biggest points? And I saw a lot of people already talking about that. From my perspective, from 8 to 11, the biggest point was the Java EE libraries being removed, especially JAX-B was a big one. That was one that hit a lot of people, and the other modules, but JAX-B was the biggest one. The other one that we ran into, because we did migration tooling, was ASM. So any library that you have that does any bytecode manipulation or deals with bytecode at all, you're definitely going to have to upgrade. So those are the biggest two that I really hit when I was doing migration for our applications. How about you, Trisha?
My main pain point, and I have since learned don't do this, was I was actually trying to adopt modules. And I know we want to talk a little bit about modules later, but I was actually...
We could do it now.
Okay.
Some people in the chat were talking about it even.
Okay. So I know that one of the big concerns is around modules, moving from class path to module path, modularizing the JVM. Jigsaw was this big project, and everyone kind of there was a lot of work involved in it for the JDK team, and so it seemed like it was going to be the big blockage for moving off 8. I think at the end of the day, there was a lot of work for the Java language people doing that stuff and modularizing the JVM, which I think was the right thing to do, has allowed them to move forward in a lot of ways now. But ultimately, we don't need to retrofit modules to our own code, and we don't need to use the module system. And when I did try to retrofit modules to my code, and my code was an example application, it was quite a small one. It was quite a lot of work, and I was doing it very early on. I was doing it like before 9 was actually released, but it was quite a lot of work, and it didn't give me a lot of benefits because a lot of us are already creating our code in a modular way. We're using modules through Maven or Gradle or through IntelliJ or writing microservices or whatever. We've already done the work, hopefully, to split our code into smaller sections. And if we haven't done that work, that's a lot of work, regardless of which mechanism you want to do to break your monolith into something smaller. So I think the main thing I always try and tell people if they're scared of moving off 8 is you don't have to use the module system. And in actual fact, I've even been to a couple of talks where people from Oracle have said, we recommend that you don't unless you really, really need to, because it is quite a lot of work. And if your application works and is architected the way you want it, then there's not a lot of benefits for adopting the module system for your particular code.
I do want to +1 that, because I've talked to a lot of developers that even started doing the modular, breaking their application into modules, and they're like, it just was too much work, and we went back. So to me, you don't have to use modules if you don't want to, and it should not be even a thought in your mind that stops you from migrating because you think you're going to use modules. It's just another extra feature that you could use or not use. Johan, go ahead and share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. When I like the idea of modularization, and I completely understand that they did it for the JDK. But when even a couple of years after 9 was released, I started to create example applications for a training course. And I could find one library that actually was modularized, and that was a logging framework with a milestone release. For the rest, I hardly could find anything that contained modules. And I think in the end, modules might be beneficial if you create libraries or stuff like that, and you want to shield away your internals so that your customers don't use it. Therefore, it's perfectly good solution. However, for like end-user applications, the benefits are already smaller. But one thing that I found interesting and actually basically made me investigating modules was JLink, to basically create your own runtime, which is optimized and consumes less memory because you don't use the entire JDK or JRE, but you optimize and only use the Java JDK modules that you actually need in your application. However, that is quite a challenge if the dependencies that you use don't use modules, because then you manually need to go through all kinds of hoops. And in the end, I was like, yeah, this is way too much hassle for me. But the funny thing is, like, we're years after Java 9 now, and I recently heard that actually Spring is modularizing the Spring application now. So if they do that, maybe even for the dependencies they have, then it might become actually relatively easy to create a modularized application and use JLink to create optimized runtimes. So there I still see a bit of benefit, again, maybe to save some memory or to start the application a bit quicker. But indeed, I think people should consider it as a feature that's optional to use and not something that's mandatory. You're perfectly fine not using them. And I think like 95 or 99% of all applications don't use modules explicitly. So that's fine.
Yeah, and maybe that's a question for the audience: is are you using modules if you've already migrated to 11 or 9 and after? And I see Brian Vermeer in the chat, and that reminds me of the Sync survey, JVM survey that came out, and most developers that have already migrated are not using modules, which tells you kind of the direction everyone is taking. And I know when we were talking, Johan, you were saying when you went and did the migration, a lot of the frameworks didn't use modules. So it's a good indication that you're okay if you don't use them. But if you want to try it out, definitely go ahead and do so. So back to the 8 to 11 question. I see a lot of great insight in the chat about how long it took. Some people said it just kind of almost worked, which is impressive. And some people said it did take some time. A lot of it has to do with dependencies, and it kind of mimics what we've seen is if the dependency is available on the latest versions, then it's not going to be as big of a problem.
I had a question
ahead,
for the audience, actually, because quite a few people in the audience mentioned that migrating the tests was going to be a pain. And I'm really interested in that because I have heard that. And I kind of want to know more about that, because if you're using JUnit to unit test your code, I don't see what the problem is. Or is it something more complex, like you've created your own test framework, or the tests are retrofitted to a legacy application that maybe isn't designed for unit testing, or fundamentals have changed? For example, I know that the JVM itself changed things like the format of its log messages. So I can imagine there are some types of homegrown monitoring systems that might be dependent upon things like log formats and underlying knowledge of the internals, and maybe some tests like that as well. So I really want to hear from the audience, what are the pain points specifically around testing? Because I kind of want to know what that looks like.
Yeah, I've had a few of those as well, especially in things like mocking frameworks who use quite some internal code from the JDK. So especially if you migrate to 17, then some things fail. And also because it uses the class file stuff from the JDK, I regularly got nice messages like a class file major version and then some weird number, which for 17 is 61. Which basically means that that framework isn't running on Java 17 properly. So yeah, I think most changes I did were actually in unit test and unit test dependencies to make them compatible again. I found some small issues with Mockito.
Right. When I was migrating stuff from 8 to 11, I took some open source frameworks, smallish ones again, and migrated them. I generally found a lot of the problems went away, like we said, if you were using the most recent versions of the mocking frameworks. But I did see that the mocking frameworks, particularly, basically any sort of library which is going to go into the internals of the JVM and the JDK and kind of like try and do things it shouldn't do, that was not always going to go wrong, but that was always going to be more of a problem given all of the changes that went on inside the JDK after 8.
Yeah, there it also pays off to be a little bit lazy and wait till your dependencies release new versions. For instance, Lombok didn't work on Java 16, but like 2 weeks later, they already released a new version that was working on Java 16. So that helps a bit.
And that's a great segue to talking about 11 to 17. So, going from 11 to 17, the biggest thing I saw was the strong encapsulation. There is the illegal access flag that used to be available, and it was on by default before. And then going from 16 to 17, that flag was removed. They've made it extra hard to reach those internals. And Johan, you've had experience with that. How much did that change impact you when you were migrating from 16 to 17 or 11 to 17?
Yeah, it impacted quite a bit, especially again for dependencies like the test dependencies for Mockito and things like that, Lombok. So basically, in 17, you cannot use the -- illegal access modifier anymore, which I think it's weird in some sense that basically they tell you not to use the internals, but then you get a flag to still have access to it. It's like getting a lock on your door and then leaving it open all the time. It feels a bit weird. So I think it was a good step that they closed that door. However, there is an alternative, which was already there in 16, where you could open up specific modules. So instead of opening up the entire door, you could open up a few windows, so to speak. And then you could specify per internal module if it should be open or not. And you could use that in the Maven compiler or in Surefire plugins or things like that to again access those internals. But I would say, yeah, you could do this now and quickly make your application running on 17. But in 18, probably it will become even harder. So I would say pick the pain now and make sure your dependencies are up to date. And I only had I think one unit test which used Java internals which failed, which we wrote ourselves. But there are higher level APIs now available that you can use. And in the case of the unit test, I could simply rewrite it to test the same functionality without even having to use those internals. So upgrading dependencies again solved most of the issues, and I don't recommend using all the add opens or minus illegal access, because it feels like a dirty workaround for me.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up a little bit on that as well. I think that what was good about the way that things were approached from 9 onwards is that I think what Oracle really wanted to do was make 9 like much more secure, much more encapsulated, and much more safe. But realistically, like you said, like that, a lot of the libraries and frameworks and your own code was just not going to work that way. So they gave people the keys to open up the little bits and pieces if they really needed to. In fact, it was open by default and then stuff like that. So I think over time, since 9, which is 4 years ago, we've kind of gradually moved to this safer, more secure way of working. Having worked on open source libraries, as a library developer, you do want to lock code away sometimes and say, no, stop reaching inside my code and poking around with my internals, because like if I want to move forward, if I want to evolve my own code to give you more features, I'm going to be dragged back by the fact that the users are using stuff they're not supposed to use, and I can't refactor safely because people can reach inside and change things. And it's the same with the JVM. They wanted to make sure that you couldn't reach in and do stuff you shouldn't be doing. So that's kind of where I wanted to go a little bit with this point. In our own application code, particularly when we're working for enterprises and we're not doing things like developing libraries for other people, generally speaking, we should be trying to do things the right way. We shouldn't be finding little back doors or going, oh, it's quite a neat trick. If we read the log here, it will tell me exactly what I need. Like, yes, but, and over time, since 9 in particular, there are more and more correct and easier ways to do some of those things. We shouldn't be reaching on the inside and using misc.sun and all of those things that we shouldn't have been using in the first place. So I also recognize that there's not always the right way to do stuff, and there's a pragmatism around yes, but there really is no other way of doing this. But I want people to sort of stop and ask themselves, if 4 years ago there was no better way to do this, we had to poke around the internals, we had to call this method, I want you to reevaluate for yourselves and see, probably there's now a library that will do that for you, or probably there's a better method to do that. So if your tests are failing because they're trying to do something which was a little bit I'm not going to use the word hacky, interesting in the first place, then perhaps that this is a good opportunity to try and get it to work in a more stable way.
And I want to really stress on that point, because if nothing else from this episode, I want to make sure we stress, growing from 11 to 17 or 8 to 17, I think one of the biggest shifts is to do this encapsulation. So when you migrate, if you're going to run into any issues, it's probably going to be a result of strong encapsulation. And the solution is going to be either updating the dependencies if the issue is the dependencies themselves and not your app, or if it's in your app, you're going to have to possibly rewrite some of the calls that you're making. And there is always replacement. The Java doc tells you, by the way, this is not proper. You should be replacing it with this and that. And JDEPS can help you with that. If you run JDEPS on your jar, it'll tell you, by the way, you're using this internal. You shouldn't be using it. Here's the recommendation instead. So definitely be using those tools. We will tell you that there is a hacky way to get those internals to still show up, but we recommend not using them. I also noticed that in the JEP itself, when it talks about strong encapsulation, they were talking about how there are certain classes that are still available, even though you really shouldn't be using them, like the unsafe class, if I remember that correctly. And even though technically you can still use them, ask yourself, just like Trisha saying, ask yourself, should I be really using this? And is there a better replacement for it? It's a good time to kind of clean up your code and make sure that you're doing things the proper way. That way you don't get unexpected behavior when they change the internals. Because as we know, sometimes you just kind of want to do your own changes in your application. And, the JVM is just like another application. They want to change their internals, and they shouldn't be held accountable to someone that is reaching in and using them and then seeing a different behavior. So it's a good time to look at your application, do some cleanup, do some upgrading dependencies, and so on and so forth. And Johan, you talked, there's other things that you talked about running into when you're going from 11 to 17 that maybe not necessarily have to do with strong encapsulation. Can you talk to us about that a little bit? And anyone in the audience too, if you already did the migration to 17, let us know what issues you ran into.
Yeah, so one of the most interesting ones, a colleague of mine discovered who uses Apache Poi to work with various Excel and Word documents. And he got weird fonts errors, which at first we didn't really understand what was going on there. But when we dove in, we figured out that in the newer versions of Java, no fonts are present anymore. In the past, there were a few fonts, I don't know, like 6 fonts or something like that present in the JDK. So those could be used by the applications you were running on it. Nowadays, there is no font available anymore, so Java will look at the operating system and see if there are any fonts installed on the operating system. However, we were using fairly small Docker images. I believe it were Alpine Docker images who didn't contain any fonts at all. So then both Java and the operating system didn't have any fonts, and we got weird issues. The solution there was to easily add those fonts to the operating system, and then you're again good to go. But it was, I think, one of the most interesting changes I saw. Another interesting one I saw was when I did an upgrade, I got an error because of Nashorn. Nashorn is a JavaScript engine. I saw it quite a bit in the past in conference sessions, which looked quite cool, but I've never really seen it being used in a project. But when I was actually migrating our projects, I found out we were actually using it. And there we could simply add the dependency to Nashorn, and then you could again keep running those applications. So those were, I think, two quite interesting cases that we saw.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the feedback, even on the chat, is making sure dependencies are up to date and all that stuff. The font one was really interesting because I saw the change, but I wasn't really sure how it's going to impact things. But yeah, if you are using Docker and it doesn't have access to any fonts, you're going to get some weird errors. So that was really interesting. So back to the dependency talk. Do you all use any tooling to make sure that your dependencies are up to date and making sure that it's not as painful to update your dependency? I know I use Dependabot in some of my projects. Do you have any recommendations around that area?
I do. There's obviously I'm a big fan of IntelliJ IDEA, and the new feature in IntelliJ IDEA 2021. What are we on? 2? Yes, 2021.2 introduced a new dependencies window, and that dependencies window will actually tell you if any of your dependencies are out of date. And in actual fact, once that's it's a new window, so I'm not sure exactly like how mature the support there is, but I have noticed that in my POM file and in my build.gradle file, IntelliJ IDEA will now highlight my dependencies in yellow if there's a more recent one. And it never used to do that. So now you can just go to the dependencies window and say update all, and update all of your library dependencies. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily work for things like updating your application servers or anything which is outside of your dependency manager. But that is a nice, quick way. You can just do it in like one commit in VCS and update everything. Don't change anything else. Just update your dependencies and do it in one hit.
I got really excited when I saw that window because it does kind of give you a GUI of all the versions, and then it gives you an option to just click update all, which is all I want to do. I just want to click a button and have it do it for me. Johan, any tooling that you recommend?
Yeah, we've been using the Renovate bot, which basically creates pull requests automatically for new versions. And we've also been using, I think, Maven and Gradle plugins to simply display what the latest version was that's available. And one interesting plugin I saw recently was the old group IDs alerter plugin, which also alerts you if you use some dependencies that maybe got new names or were forked or whatever. For instance, with the Java EE dependencies were now called Jakarta. If you just use the latest version, you're on something which is still relatively old. So it's also good to not only update the dependencies to the latest version, but also check if there are other alternatives available. I've seen a couple of times with some frameworks which were no longer maintained, but somebody forked it and created some new names for it. So I think that's also something important to keep track of.
That's a really good point. The Java X to Jakarta namespace change, because for me, I had an app running on Tomcat 9 or something older, and then I upgraded to Tomcat 10, and it just stopped working, and I had no idea what was going on because the error was not helpful at all. And it turned out it was because I was using Java X instead of Jakarta. But then some of the classes required Jakarta, and some of the classes still require Java X. So there's a little bit of, we're kind of in the middle of things right now with Java, where Java EE and Jakarta EE are happening. So I recommend, as you're migrating your applications, kind of pay attention to when you upgrade your application server. If you're not using Jakarta, your application server might want you to use Jakarta moving forward. I know some applications are supporting certain versions of Jakarta versus others, but it might just work. So I don't want to say, one way or the other, but just be paying attention to the namespace change. You'll eventually need to switch from Java X to Jakarta if you're wanting to use Jakarta EE9 or later. But just FYI, that's another one that you'll want to look out for.
Dalia, didn't you do a video on Jakarta EE at some point?
I did do a video on Jakarta EE and how to create your first Jakarta EE application. I do want to do some migration ones, because there's a button in IntelliJ IDEA now that switches your Java X to Jakarta namespace, and I thought that was really helpful, because there's a lot of classes and some of them switch and some of them didn't. So I'm definitely looking forward to doing something on that. I do see some of the folks in the chat talking about how the JDK upgrade is quite trivial, and I think some cases they are trivial, some cases are not trivial. And I think some of it has to do with kind of your systems in place. So like, your CI/CD pipeline and how easy it makes it to upgrade Java versions. So is there any recommendation around that area, or anything you've done that has made the upgrades easier? And Johan, I know we've talked, Trisha too. We've talked a little bit about that. So, and anyone in the chat, if you have any experience with upgrading and making that easy, what have you done to make it easier and easier?
I have a quick and slightly facetious but still true piece of advice. You should have a CI pipeline. And I'm kind of like surprised that, not really surprised, but it's 2021 and there are plenty of organizations that still don't have a set of automated tests which run on commit. And if you do have a set of automated tests which can automatically run, it will make it a lot easier for you to find out if you have problems migrating your version of Java.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, and I think if you look at how easy it is to migrate, in the past we often had build servers which were maintained by a central team who then needed to be convinced to install a new version of Java, and sometimes you couldn't even run two versions at the same time, so everybody had to migrate at once. And the same hassle we had for production and test environments where other teams were responsible for running them. So we needed to somehow get a schedule so that they would update it at the same pace that we migrated our application, basically. So that was quite a bit of a challenge in the past. Nowadays, at least in our company, we're using Docker a lot, which works as a nice abstraction layer. Of course, there are other options as well as abstraction layers, but I think Docker is nowadays quite popular. So both our build environment runs with Docker containers and our production environment as well. So each team can, whenever they want, upgrade their build to whatever Java version they want. And the same goes basically for all the test and production environments. So that basically gives the team all the freedom to plan it whenever they want. They don't have to wait until other teams are available or certain other issues are resolved. So I think that helps.
That's a really good point. And I think there are still plenty of organizations that do have some of those systems centralized. But I don't want to be the one to use the word cloud, because I always think that people like overuse it to fix everything. But with cloud services available, I know not every organization is free to use whichever cloud provider they want, but it is possible to spin up some services in some sort of cloud provider, maybe even an internal cloud provider in some of these large organizations, to try and run your test suite against a different JVM, because that sort of thing was just, like you say, it wasn't possible in the past. You'd have to physically find the server and drop a different JDK in there. But now there's no reason why you couldn't just spin up a temporary service to try and figure out what your problems are.
Definitely. And all the newer tooling has made it, a lot easier to do those kinds of things. I was surprised when after I containerized my application, and then I wanted to use a newer version of Java or even Tomcat. It was just kind of changing the line in my from, and just changing that up. And I was like, oh, that's nice. That's really nice. And I see some people in the chat, they are using Docker more and more to make that upgrade easier. So really great to see folks kind of pipeline benefit from containerization and all those kinds of things. So that's awesome. I did want to go back a step, because I feel like we need kind of a checklist of all the things you're going to need to do. So I wanted to say, not only are you going to need to upgrade your dependencies, but you're going to also need to update your tooling. So make sure you update Gradle and Maven, because I know those two can be issues. And I know who was saying that Gradle is a little bit behind.
I have said it in the past, but someone said it in the chat. When Java 17 came out and I tried to use it with Gradle, like on that same week, Gradle didn't support it fully there and then. So sometimes you need to wait a few weeks for Gradle.
I looked it up, and they, I think, will release 7.3, if I'm correct, which should support Java 17, but it's not yet released, so they're lagging a bit behind. Yeah,
I am using 7.2 at the moment. It's not erroring. But if they say that it doesn't fully support Java 17, then it's not erroring is not the same as working, is it?
Yeah, so especially if you want to try out, I wanted to try out how our applications would react to new versions of Java. So I did migrations with early access versions of Java. And then with Maven, that worked out of the box from the beginning. I only needed to make sure my compiler and other plugins were up to date. But for Gradle, yeah, you need to wait a little bit. So if you really want to try out things in advance, I would recommend to use Maven.
So I just want to interject even more. I'm a big fan of Gradle. I really like Gradle because I like Gradle. I just like the way that the file is much smaller than an XML file. But one of the reasons why Gradle suffers a little bit more than Maven is that it's got multiple issues that it needs to address when there's a new version of Java, because it's not just it needs to take advantage of whatever's new in Java or it needs to use the new flags. It's also that Gradle is using Groovy, so it has a dependency on Groovy to also have updated itself for the latest version of Java. So it can be a little bit more of a wait to make sure that's fully supported.
Yeah, I honestly feel a little bit better whenever I see folks that are slow to upgrade, because it makes me feel better about my app. It's like, it's okay if it takes a little bit. I don't need to upgrade the same day, because they're having the same issues we're going to have. So, having a little bit of kind of expectation to say, maybe they're not available right now, but they will be, and keeping an eye out on their pages to see what they fully support. And I love that not arrowing out versus fully support, because maybe it works for your app, but maybe it won't eventually. So just kind of pay attention to when they say we fully support Java 17 or not. So, Gradle, Maven, application servers are another place where I have it's close to my heart, because I worked on WebSphere and Open Liberty, and it was a lot of work to get us working with the most recent Java versions, because we use a lot of stuff that has to do with the internals, and we're using a lot of things that are hard to migrate. So, a little bit of grace with the library developers, and just kind of keeping an eye out to see when they're going to be coming out with the new version that supports your Java version. I feel like we are moving a lot faster though. And I feel like everyone in the industry is kind of realizing that it's going to be beneficial to keep moving forward. And I like Kedar's comment in the YouTube channel. He's saying making dependency updates and upgrades part of day-to-day activity has helped us a lot with migration pain. And I think that is the biggest thing, because a lot of times when you're upgrading, it's not really your app that's the problem, it's the dependency that's the problem. And if the more you ease that pain, the better it's going to be overall. And I really like that point here. And thank you for linking to my Docker videos, Trisha.
I love your Docker videos. I like to promote them anytime I can.
Appreciate it. Docker is hard to get used to, but once you do, you really realize the benefits of Docker. So definitely recommend, if you're scared of Docker, to go ahead and, I have video series that introduce you to Docker, but there's a lot of good resources out there that talk to you about adopting Docker and the benefits of it. And it does have some benefits. It's not just a buzzword, and it's definitely has its benefits once you kind of get a hold of how to use it for your application. Go ahead,
sorry.
Trisha.
I wanted to interrupt a little while back, but I was too busy answering questions on the channel. One of the reasons, this has been referred to several times throughout what we've been saying, one of the best or possibly worst reasons to upgrade to the most recent version of Java is that once you have certainly got past the 11 thing, it is going to be easier to keep updating that. So the best reason to upgrade is because it will be painful to upgrade the first time, and it will not be painful after that. Will be painful. It might be painful, but the experience that we're seeing is that, as you said, with the 6 monthly release cadence, with the industry sort of staying up to date, with the fact that you have early access versions of Java, which our libraries and frameworks can be coding against very early on, the stuff that's coming out now is quite well integrated and tested, and so that you can move from release to release every 6 months much more comfortably than in the olden days when we went from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8 in this big bang. Really difficult. There's no Docker, no cloud, and also there's a lot of new features type migrations. These are not the types of migrations we're doing anymore. We are doing these incremental, small, more painless migrations.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I do want to kind of, start summarizing here that if you've already migrated from 8 to 11, you've done the harder migration, because 11 to 17 is typically easier. So if you're still on 8 to 17, be on the lookout for what you're searching for as far as like search terms, because it's not going to have to do necessarily with going to 17. It might have to do with the fact that you're going to 11. So I don't know if y'all recommend, if you're on 8, to go to 11 and then 17, or go straight up to 17. Do you have a recommendation on that?
Yeah. I would say that you can do it step by step, because you need to do the work anyhow. But if you upgrade your dependencies up front, because I always recommend to upgrade the dependencies on your current version of Java, and then you simply try to run the newest version of Java, you'll quickly see if there are still any challenges. I think in general, there won't be that many challenges once your dependencies are up to date. So you could try to do it at once, and if you run into issues, you use an intermediate version of Java and run it there, if you cannot find with Google which version of Java caused it. But I would say that nowadays, maybe even the biggest challenge of upgrading Java is to pick a JDK or a JRE, because there are so many around there. It's hard to pick the right one, or at least one that suits your needs.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I know we don't have much time, but maybe a minute or two. So for me, I always just recommended using Adopt OpenJDK. But Johan, you were saying a little bit more about vendors and switching vendors, and what you've been using. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Adopt OpenJDK, which is nowadays Adoptium. It's quite a big community project, and I think it's one of the ones that's most heavily used. And we were using them as well, and then the JRE they produced. However, they decided to not produce JREs for Java 17 and up. They say that it's better to use JLink, and from a theoretical point of view, I agree on that. But from a practical point of view, using JLink also needs a couple of extra steps and extra work in build pipelines and stuff like that. So for now, we prefer to stay on JREs. And we found out that, for instance, Liberica still offers JREs. They even offer multiple JREs. And one of the interesting things is that items just like JavaFX, they have been removed in one of the Java versions, so you can add it as a dependency. But there are also still vendors who offer a JDK which still includes JavaFX, such as, again, Liberica with a full version, or the OJDK build. So there are many versions available. Even like before, we all used either Oracle or the IBM JDK. Oracle became paid, so most people, I think, or even everyone, picked another vendor. And now Oracle, again, is sort of free, but make sure that you read the terms, because I think you need someone from legal to figure out if it's really free. There are some pros and cons in that. So there are many choices now. And I think where you should look at is, do you need something like a JDK or a JRE? Do you need a Docker image? But also, how long do you need support? If you want to use the non-LTS versions, most vendors only give minor updates for 6 months until the next non-LTS version or LTS version is released. I heard Azul is offering longer support than those 6 months. So if you plan on using those versions and you want to have more than 6 months of support, then you could use Azul, or maybe there are other ones who also offer it. So there are a lot of them, and I cannot really say this is the one you need to pick, but if you list some criteria, you can stripe away quite a few of them and then see what fits best in my case.
I actually want to pick up a little bit on that. This idea of long-term support releases is an Oracle idea. It was introduced by Oracle that every 3 years there would be a long-term support release. They have nominated 11 and 17 as their long-term support releases. Generally speaking, the other vendors have also kind of followed suit because it's a little bit easier. But as you mentioned, Azul, they have this idea of like I can't remember what they called it. It's like a half long-term support, a medium-term support release, I think it is. So one in the middle, somewhere around, I think they picked 15 as being their one to be like, look, you might not want to go from 11 to 17. You might want to have a staging point in the middle. So yes, it absolutely does matter which vendor you use. Dalia and I have been kind of suggesting adopt OpenJDK for licensing reasons, if you're not really sure what you want to do, and like you don't need your lawyers to be going through it. But I actually didn't know that some of the JDKs were bundling JavaFX, and I do know that a lot of people are struggling with that change of taking JavaFX out of the JDK, because JavaFX is not as straightforward as just add another dependency, which I didn't really understand that. It's like, why is it not just another dependency? Well, it's a UI tool. It's a graphical user interface. It relies on your operating system to create those graphics. So it is a much more complicated process than simply dropping in a new dependency. So yeah, understanding what the vendors are offering, what the length of their support is, how much it's going to cost you or not, and which are their long-term support releases, and JRE versus JDK. It's important to understand those things.
Yeah, I think the JDK JRE one was interesting to me, because if you're using the JDK, you can still get that from Adopt OpenJDK or Adoptium. But I think there's a lot of changes happening in that space. But just kind of be on the lookout. Don't let the choices of vendors intimidate you. You can, make a decision, and we're out here like answering questions and all that stuff because we want folks to adopt the latest version of Java without a lot of hassle. So be on the lookout for that, and definitely ask questions. I know we're kind of running out of time here, so this is a good time to end it. I do want to say that I've linked some links to the presentations that Trisha, Johan, and me have done about migration. Definitely check those out. We talk a lot more detail about migrating and what to do and what to expect and all that stuff, because we love the topic. So you'll find it in the description down below. Since this is IntelliJ IDEA channel, don't forget to upgrade your IntelliJ IDEA to take advantage of the latest Java versions and the latest Java features too, because we make suggestions on how to take advantage of those new Java features like records or whatever else you're wanting to use. And of course, upgrade your other IDs if you're using other IDs. Yeah, shaking your head. But if you're on IntelliJ IDEA, you're definitely getting a lot of awesome support there. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much, Trisha and Johan, for joining me. This has been fantastic. And thank you so much for the audience for answering our questions and adding their thoughts. It was extremely beneficial for me, and I thank you all.
There was a good question from the audience, actually, which is, what is our next coffee club? I don't know if we've announced it yet.
We have not, because we're still talking about ideas and topics. If you have a topic, pick me on Twitter and give it to me, because we're kind of debating topics. If you really want to hear about certain topics, please DM me or post in the chat here. We're always looking for new topics to talk about, and we love the topics that come from our listeners and audience.
Thanks, Dalia. You were fantastic hosting this, as usual.
Thanks, Trisha. And thank you so much, Johan, for coming as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Johan. You are our first outside of JetBrains guest. Congratulations.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bye.